This is the Puck Poolies podcast with Matt Larkin and Stephen Ellis.
Podcast. It's Matt Larkin here with Stephen Ellis, and it's a really important week for many of you, especially in head-to-head leagues. It's playoff time, so we are here to help with some crucial advice. And first off, Stephen, I'm going to assume you made the playoffs in your tiny little league. Does everyone make the playoffs?
So yes, everyone makes the playoffs in a 4-team league, but we actually haven't started the playoffs yet. I think we have 2 more weeks, so we got that. But last week was the scariest week I've had in fantasy hockey in a long time because I'm playing the team that was basically tanking from the start. They had a very poor draft because they didn't understand how the draft format worked, the auction draft, and picked guys like Chad Chris and Chad Rudel, and it kind of said, "Oh, I'll just pick guys up later," but didn't realize his team was terrible. Well, I was losing to him for about 6 days. I was losing him like this would have been embarrassing because he was away for a couple of days and forgot to actually set his lineup for the first couple of days. So he literally had 3 empty spots. The thing was, he also had Jacob Markstrom, who played really well, got a lot of points. Nikita Kucherov, who also got a lot of points, and Cale Makar, who was Cale Makar. And all 3 of them basically took over. It really actually just took me going out there and picking up Ville Husso and Jeremy Swayman on the last day, saving those 2 spots for the last day to make sure I could actually get any points, because otherwise I know the roster players playing that day. And if I didn't do that, I would have lost the pool, which would have been super embarrassing to a guy who was trying to get the first overall pick next year when we switched the format. So, yeah, not my favorite week. I won, and I'm already winning again, but that was a little scary.
Yeah, I can imagine. Against a team that apparently is just made of all Chads. That's pretty terrifying. I'm in the playoffs in mine. I qualified as the 4 seed, and it does feel like I have home ice. I have a big man game advantage over my opponent this week. Elias Pettersson has been unbelievable for basically the second half of the season. He's sort of become a superstar, so he's been carrying my team, and I have a big advantage in goalie games as well. So it feels like I'm the heavy favorite, although my opponent, he got 5 power play points on Monday, and there were 3 games on the schedule, so that's a little bit unlucky, but what are you going to do? I'm going to soldier on, and let's hopefully make the semifinal. So let's get down to it, Stephen, and do some pickup discussion. I know there are a lot of anxious GMs out there trying to get ahead in their playoffs, so let's do it, my friend.
All right, we're going to start with the shallow pickup of the week, and that is David Perron.
Yeah, this is a weird one. Okay, so I'm doing something I don't normally do, because often when you're making a recommendation, there's a rhyme or reason to it. It's a player whose role has changed, a player who's hot, although sometimes that can mean you're sort of chasing points. And this time, I'm going to try and help you get ahead of it. This is a chance to get an advantage where there may not appear to be one in your matchup. And David Perron, a notoriously streaky player who often goes on random tears late in seasons. His role in Detroit has not changed. He's still second on the team in power play minutes per game among the forwards. He's been playing the point. And especially because of that power play role, he has the ability to randomly just have a big week for you at any given time. So focus more on his role, not as much about the season that he's having right now, which has been a little bit subpar. But if you're looking for an edge where it just seems like there isn't one in a shallow league, I would consider scooping him and rolling him out there. As strange as it may sound, I think he can give you a little bit of an advantage. And he's available in 54% of Yahoo leagues.
Yeah, I like that one. Next up, medium pickup is Evan Rodriguez from Colorado.
Yeah, so this one I think is more obvious. Of course, we know the Colorado Avalanche have one of the most favorable fantasy schedules this week in terms of number of games. Evan Rodriguez available in 79% of leagues. And just based on the health of the Colorado lineup, he's been elevated to that top line, playing the left wing spot with Nathan McKinnon and Mikko Rantanen. And what I like about Rodriguez, especially in leagues that count shots, he's just a very high volume shooter. He's 92nd percentile 5-on-5 in shots per 60 minutes. And he seems pretty secure on that top line, or at the very, very worst, in the top 6. Now that we know Arturi Lekkonen's out, that just solidifies the notion that Rodriguez is going to stay in that top 6. Of course, he can play center as well, but I think Colorado needs him to play the wing right now. So he's in a plum spot. He's going to have high-end line mates. So that is a sneaky pickup available in 79% of leagues right now.
All right. And the deep league pickup is an interesting one. Barrett Hayton, a guy that was drafted way higher than he should have. I did not like the pick at the time, but he's having a career season.
Yeah, that 2018 draft class was just sort of a minefield. And Barrett Hayton, it's almost like, okay, he's available in 88% of leagues, but I think even in a medium league, you have to consider picking him up because he's been that hot. He's got 19 points in his past 20 games. He's got 8 points in his past 4 games because he's riding the coattails of Clayton Keller, who's been absolutely on fire. I traded him. It's stinging me right now. But Barrett Hayton, he's got that great shot, 61 shots over that 20-game hot streak as well. He's got the first-round pedigree, so maybe this is a player who just took a little while to figure it out. But right now, he's got a great deployment, and he's just on fire in the short term, but even a bigger sample size, 20 games. He's been excellent, and I'm kind of surprised that he's available in so many leagues. It feels like people are asleep at the switch there. I would rush to grab him in a deep league, and I'd even consider in a medium league scooping him up too.
The WTF pickup of the week. This one, again, it's a little surprising given how well he's been playing this year that he isn't picked up more often, and that is Philip Gustafson.
Philip Gustafson, the Minnesota Wild, having a tremendous season. He's available in 28% of leagues, and it really should be 0. That's why I put him in the WTF category. Among goalies with 30 or more games played this season, he's second in save percentage only to Linus Ullmark, the Vezina Trophy frontrunner. 931 save percentage for Philip Gustafson. And I think the reason why that ownership tag is a little bit low is there's a perception, well, there's always Marc-Andre Fleury to compete with him for starts. And yes, that's true, but I think now they're at a 50-50 split, if not slightly starting to tilt toward Gustafson. Since January 1st, Gustafson's played 17 games, 940 save percentage. Fleury 16 games with a 916, and Fleury is owned in 90% of leagues. Gustafson's owned in 72%. That doesn't make sense. It should be the reverse. If anything, he's been tremendous for rate stats. And in this era of platooning goalies, a goalie who plays half the games, that's still plenty valuable. It's a lot more valuable than it was even 5-10 years ago, because now, just in general, there are not as many goalies who play a ton of games. So a goalie who can play 41 games in the season, that's a reasonable workload. That can be, at worst, your number 2 fantasy goalie. So Gustafson should be owned in every fantasy league right now.
All right, I like it. And the tip of the week is know who you can and can't cut. And right now, I really wish I could cut JT Miller. But anyways.
Yeah, so it sounds like a really simple piece of advice, but I think it's important for multiple reasons. One, most leagues have a can't cut list. And during the fantasy playoffs, desperate things happen where you might have a player who's day-to-day with a little bit of an injury who you need to cut just to make room to make that crucial roster swap to stay alive. So it's important to know which players are eligible, which ones aren't. And also in a different sense, that's more of a literal sense, who's on the actual can't cut list, but more in a figurative sense. It helps to sort of assess your roster early in this playoff matchup, get a good sense of who's on thin ice for you, who you can cut easily, because when there's a hot pickup happening, the competition's fierce right now, and you don't want to be hesitating, humming and hawing over your roster for an extra 10 minutes, and maybe that's the window where your opponent scoops this player that you really wanted to get. So if you know who is getting the quick hook in advance, you see a good pickup, you know, boom, you can drop so-and-so at the drop of a hat because you've already worked it out in your head who's the first player to go. So little mental advantages like that are important when you're in a really tight matchup in a head-to-head playoff league.
Yeah, it's something where, like, with JT Miller, and I was very close to being able to successfully trade him on the show a couple months ago, and it didn't end up happening. But, part of that is kind of just the offset of the fact that he can play center, left wing, and right wing has actually been very helpful for me. I've been able to use him most nights, but it's like he's kind of like I just kind of want him to, okay, I don't want to say I want him to get injured, but there were points where it's like if I could put him on IR and I can go pick up someone else in that spot, would have been nice, but I hate can't cut lists. I'll tell you that.
Yeah. And at least if your league counts shorthanded points, JT Miller and Elias Pettersson have been absolute gold lately. Yeah. So if you don't count that, then I can totally see it. Okay, Stephen, we're going to move on now and bring in one of our favorite guests for some more fantasy playoff advice. It's Nick Alberga. Back, a very special guest, maybe our favorite guest. Maybe if we broke our guests into lines, this would be our first line center, part of the Nation Network, host of Leafs Morning Take. Nick Alberga is here to help with some fantasy playoff advice. Nick, how are you doing, my friend?
I'm doing fairly well. The Oakville trifecta boys back together, and I will tell you as the fantasy playoffs get underway, I got a nice kick in the pills on Monday when one of my opponents, there's 3 games on the slate, somehow figures out to get 13 points. Like, it's over already.
Wow, that's painful. At least it could be worse. Michael Bublé in my league has Andrei Svechnikov and Arturi Lehkonen.
Ooh.
He's just apoplectic right now, which I am very happy about, but tough break for the first place team.
You're just a jerk.
Yeah, that's tough. Well, hey, man, I'm competitive. So is he. Okay, he's my enemy in this context. So, Nick, One thing I want to ask you to get started here, because I think you are the steady hand to guide our listeners through the fantasy playoffs. Looking at this week's schedule, because I feel like schedule matters a lot in head-to-head leagues in the playoffs more than any other time. Do you see any advantages that can be exploited right now?
It's everything, quite frankly, and I am a big proponent of schedule manipulation come the fantasy hockey playoffs. Obviously, if you're in a standard non-keeper head-to-head league, it makes a lot of sense. I think automatically you have to look at those 4-game teams. We talk about the Colorado Avalanche. They always seem to have that Monday, Wednesday, Friday type, Sunday type schedule. This week's a bit different, but still a 4-game slate. They got games on the Monday and Wednesday. They're scoring like crazy. So I've been all over them in terms of waiver ads, guys like Rodriguez. You mentioned Larkin goes down. Before that, he gets 2-1. Confer, Eller, Newhook, Sam Girard's brought me a lot of success the last couple of weeks. So I think you do your best, even with 3 games remaining on the slate, to stock up on Avalanche. The other, 13 teams: Boston, Buffalo, Columbus, Dallas, Montreal, Nashville, Jersey, the Rangers, Tampa, Toronto, Vancouver, Washington, and Winnipeg, as I'm sure you've gone over on the show. And obviously, you want to stay away from like the low volume teams. Like I do believe in quantity over quality this week, because I think you want to have as many man games as possible, Matt.
Nick, give me a forward under 10% owned who you think could put someone over the top in the playoffs.
Well, firstly, I love these questions, by the way, and I really had to dig deep for this one. But can I interest you in some Thomas Novak of the Nashville Predators? So for starters, and I have to credit my buddy Boomer Gordon on NHL Network Radio for giving this really, really good statistics. Starting March 11th, 10 games in 16 days for the Nashville Predators. So if there's a time to hop aboard the Preds Express, it's right now. On top of that, I realize they're banged up, but there's a lot of guys who have gotten promotions from all the injuries, and namely Novak, who's the number 1 C on this team right now with Tomasino and Duchesne. He's on the first power play unit. And the stats back up the addition as well. 33 games played, 12 goals, 15 assists, 27 points. He has 16 points in his past 11 outings. And last I looked, just 6% rostered in standard Yahoo leagues.
Wow, that's crazy. We mentioned it on the show last week. Just who is this guy? Where did he come from? I love that Nashville stat because I'm in the playoffs and I'm a UC Saros and Kevin Lankinen owner. So that's music to my ears, baby, for goalie games. So we're going to keep this theme going, Nick. Now we're going to switch to defensemen. I'm going to move the threshold to 20%. Yeah. Give me a defenseman under 20% owned that you think can be a difference maker in the playoffs.
So I should preface by saying this one's a bit more difficult. Obviously, there's not as much depth in fantasy hockey on the back end, but I'll take my chances with Juuso Valimaki. Around 11% rostered in standard leagues going into the week at least. He's the number 1, defenseman right now for Arizona. Chychrun's gone. Obviously, they trade Gostisbehere too. He's got 6 assists in his past 7 games, and he's running the first power play unit, right? So I will take my chance with that, especially when you look at the slate for Arizona. 3 games this week. I think they're busy next week. So that's probably the guy I would say I would go after right now is Juuso Valimaki of the Arizona Coyotes.
I like that. Now let's look at goalies, and we're going to go under 40% this time.
You like this one, Joonas Korpisalo. You talk about deadline boost, guys. Los Angeles has been fantastic. Like we were talking all season long about them defensively. Could they keep the puck out of the net? I never in my wildest dreams thought they would be entering the Stanley Cup playoffs with a tandem of Phoenix Copley and Joonas Korpisalo. Yet here we are. So around 39% rostered when I looked about 12 hours ago. Tandem with Phoenix Copley. So they pretty much split them down the middle in 4 games so far since the trade deadline. But Korpisalo's 2-0-0 at 2.01, 929. On top of that, I think it's important to stress. I know he was on lowly Columbus. He's actually been hot for a while. His last 10 appearances, 6-3-1, 2-7-1, 921. So I would go with Joonas Korpisalo of the LA Kings.
Wow, that's a low ownership number. I can't believe it. Yeah, and I think different goalie now with that hip repaired, because last year, obviously, now it's looking more and more like an anomaly now that he's got that hip all fixed up. He's healthy. So here's a fun one. It's funny. I'm just calling my own question fun. I'm just tooting my own horn.
Like it.
Great question.
Good confidence.
Yeah. But this year, I think, is a throwback to the stories of yesteryear that got boomers tell me about their hockey pools, where you had to split Wayne Gretzky and Mario Lemieux into 2 players because it was unfair to have one of them. And right now, we're seeing Connor McDavid elevate almost to that level where it feels unfair to have him because he's outscoring the rest of the league by such a wide margin. So if you're up against him in head-to-head, how do you survive the week? Is there a strategy, a weird pivot you can do to try and just weather that storm?
Well, maybe it speaks to my defeatist attitude, but one of my keeper leagues, I'm playing a guy in the playoffs in round one who has McDavid. I've already punted the next season, which meant I picked up Kochetkov. I picked Corpusalo. It's a keeper league, so I'm going to ride with those guys. I think you're the best thing you can do is pray. Unfortunately, in that league, my opponent also has Matthews. He has Marner. He's so stacked. He went all in at the deadline, so I'm in trouble. I think you just hope for the best. I mean, it's better that he's got a 3-game slate than a 4-game slate. You hope one of those games, maybe he gets 1 point, but at least 2 points per game. He is in a class of his own. It's funny, just before it came on, I was just on YouTube, and I think it was the guys over at Overdrive at TSN said there almost needs to be a Gretzky rule in effect moving forward in fantasy hockey when it comes to Connor McDavid, because he's just so out of this world. Like, for example, in a league I created this year, and I didn't mean to do this. The randomness of Yahoo. Like, I ended up getting the first overall pick, and I just put everybody up against it to begin with when I got Connor McDavid first overall. So I think we can definitively say right now, because there's always those people who want to have the conversation, come the summer, come September, there is no one in the ballpark to be the first number one fantasy pick next year in non-keeper leagues. It's Connor McDavid, then everybody else. It would be Draisaitl too. But I think you just pray and hope for the best. That's it.
So I've had a lot of luck this year against a team that has McDavid. I've
Really?
actually won all but one time, and he's not only does he have McDavid, he's got Matthews on there too,
Wow.
and I keep beating them. And part of that is because I've drafted really smartly with the goaltenders, and I'm very aggressive on my goaltenders. I had 6 goalies on the lineup basically for last weekend. I actually was just missing defensemen because our goalies are so valuable in
Yeah.
hockey. So I just literally just sacrificed having roster players so I had the goalie flexibility, and it worked out. So who is a player around 80% owned or better that you would drop in a shallow league to achieve some extra flexibility for the playoffs? And that's something that I really need to know myself.
It would be a defenseman now that you think of it and speak of it. Thomas Shabbat. I am so out. I will be honest. Pete Jensen, my co-host on the NHL Fantasy on Ice podcast, did all his best to sell me last summer. When I knew I went 3 years in a row with Shabbat. I'm like, this guy lets me down every year. But we're all hot and heavy over the Ottawa Senators, the summer of Pierre, and it really didn't turn out that way because I don't think they're going to make the Stanley Cup playoffs. But his last 6 games, he has 1 point. On top of that, he's a bit banged up from over the weekend. They picked up Chikrin. Sanderson's really, really pushing. I could see an ideal situation in, say, the next year where we're really talking and it's picking up steam about Thomas Shabbat being traded from the Ottawa Senators. There's too many cooks in that kitchen, right? And it's just always the next man up. There's the next new shiny toy approach, too. So I'm easily going to jump out on Thomas Shabbat. He just hasn't done much for me lately this year in fantasy hockey.
I can see it. He's been a ride or die guy for me every year. He's Thelma to my Louise. He just takes me off that cliff every year. I just can't quit him. Nick, fantastic advice as always. We appreciate you coming on. And before we let you go, as always, give yourself a little plug, my friend.
Yeah, check out our show, Leafs Morning Take on YouTube. It's myself alongside former Leaf Jay Rosehill, available Monday to Friday, 11 to 11:30 a.m. Eastern Time on the Leafs Nation 401, YouTube page where you can check that out. I'm also hosting the NHL Fantasy on Ice podcast alongside Pete Jensen. We put out 2 episodes a week, and again, you can find that wherever you get your podcasts.
Outstanding stuff. Thank you, Nick. Next up, it's time for some prospect talk. So, Steven, you are the expert, of course. Who do you have your eye on right now as a potential fantasy star?
Well, I'm going to go with Devon Levi. This is a guy that is going to be a very important goalie for the Buffalo Sabres. He can sign basically any time at this point. It'd be interesting to see if the Sabres use him. Usually you don't sign a college goalie and then throw him in right away, but Sabres goaltending can be hit or miss. And I think that for as good as Craig Anderson could be at points in UPL, like if you could give Devon Levi, a guy that has just played absolutely dynamite hockey the last 3 years and one of the best college goalies we've ever seen, give him some opportunities. I think you could be surprised because, the thing about throwing in a new goalie that's got all this momentum at this point is the teams haven't been scouting him. They're not scouting him like they would Craig Anderson when they've got, I don't know, he's been in the league for 425 years. Like they've got a lot of data to go off of there. But when it comes to Devon Levi, it's kind of a new thing there. So I think that Devon Levi can be a starter in the NHL. I am a little concerned about his size. He's only 6 foot, but I think that put him in there with UPL as a long-term solution, I think the Sabres would have a very strong 1-2 goalie situation going forward. And they're confident enough. They traded Eric Portillo to the LA Kings at the trade deadline. He's a big goalie himself, one with, I think, some solid promise. But Devon Levi was the guy. He put up some of the greatest numbers we've ever seen in college hockey. And I think they're going to continue to, they're going to want to exploit that as much as possible. They're going to try to see what they can use him for. And heck, maybe he's the guy that leads the team into the Stanley Cup playoffs.
Yeah, you never know. And it's weird with Buffalo. It's changed so much. The beginning of the season, it was like, okay, Eric Comrie's taken over this crease.
Mm-hmm.
And we've had, of course, Craig Anderson's had his moments. He had one this week against the Leafs. And then a month ago, it looks like UPL is taking over and becoming the guy. Now he's sort of had that speed wobble. So maybe Devon Levi just says, okay, guys, you can't figure it out. Here I come. I'm taking over this crease. So I think it's a pretty interesting bet to make. And speaking of bet, look at that. Look at that transition, Steven. It's time for our best bet of the week, brought to you by our sponsor, Proline Plus. And it's funny, I had already zeroed in on this bet before Monday's game. So I looked at the Montreal Canadiens and I was like, you know what? They are just in absolute tank mode. They lost six straight before losing a seventh straight on Monday night. They were playing a back-to-back. They had to weather a storm with Colorado in town and then immediately go on the road to play tonight against Pittsburgh. And the Penguins have scored at least 3 goals, 5 of their past 6 games. They're in desperation mode. So I already had worked this all out in my head, liking the over at 6.5 at plus 183 for this game tonight. And then the Habs were in a 12-goal barn burner on Monday. So it really just solidifies, in my mind, the Habs are kind of just, they've pieced out on this season. They're in full Connor Bedard mode now. And I think they're going to have a lot of circus games down the stretch. I'm expecting another one in Pittsburgh tonight for a really tired team. The only thing that's making me have a tiny bit of pause is if Montreal now was embarrassed by Monday night's game, giving up 8 goals, are they going to tighten their defense? I'm not sure. Either way, I don't think there's enough talent for it to matter with that team right now. So I'm liking the over 6.5. Penguins Habs plus 183 Tuesday night. What do you think?
I love that. That's a good one. I'd say that, the Canadians, sometimes they'll really surprise you when you don't expect it. And they'll go out there and give these teams a run for the money. And it usually depends on how good the goaltending is. Jake Allen and Samuel Montembeault both have some game-saving efforts this year. They're both sometimes you just expect a slaughter, and they'll go out there and get the job done. But, I think this is a good one still, regardless.
All righty. And before we finish the segment, of course, as always, a word from our sponsor. Proline Plus is not just another sportsbook, being the only sportsbook that gives 100% of the profits back to Ontario. Proline has been your local trusted sportsbook for over 30 years, now offering Ontario sports fans more ways to play, in-store, online, or take the game on the go with the Proline Plus app. With your favorite sports and events right at your fingertips, download the Proline app and bet in-app with Proline Plus today, or head over to ProlinePlus.ca to learn more. You'd think that I would memorize that by now, but I haven't. I'm still doing a little bit of reading. That's how we roll these days, Stephen. So let's move on and do some questions. We have some good ones from our listeners this week. What do we have?
Well, say that, but I'm going to call it this questioner for having a very boo name, Glass of Marlowe.
Yeah, no. It's pretty good. It's pretty good. I liked it.
That's just a generic fantasy hockey name, and it's not my thing. It's a good one though. What type of player will Rasmus Sandin become with the Washington Capitals? Is he someone to watch long term? And I'll just say, this is a guy I've followed very closely since his junior days. I always had kind of high hopes for him. I was a little surprised he fell to, depending on how you viewed it, how he fell to the Leafs in that draft. And I thought, he was showing some signs of some good quality hockey, but then kind of just got lost in the shuffle. But right now he's looking pretty good.
He is. And that's the funny thing, the question mentions long-term, but what about short-term? What about right now? He's immediately been given this enormous role with Washington Capitals. He's playing more than 25 minutes a game since the trade. He's got 8 points in 4 games. So he's already immediately becoming a very relevant fantasy defenseman. The only thing is this explosion, I think, could almost cause his value to skyrocket too much in fantasy. So I think we still have to temper our expectations a little bit. It's not like Rasmus Sandin, even in his draft year, was supposed to become Cale Makar. So I think he has a lot of potential, but I think he's more of a two-way defenseman. So I'm not seeing Rasmus Sandin putting up 80-point seasons at his peak, but I think starting as soon as next year, this could be a 45, 50-point defenseman, given the fact that his roles increased so much. And I think he's going to be a plus contributor in the hits category, maybe around 2 hits a game. So 150, 175 hits, probably 100 blocks. So in a banger format, he's going to be quite valuable as a well-rounded player. That said, I just think we have to be careful when you're drafting him, especially in redraft next year. You can't put all of your eggs in the basket of this late season hot streak because I think it's going to inflate him a little bit. So very promising, but I think he's going to be more of a D2 than a D1 in fantasy. But the value, the stock is obviously on the rise significantly.
I think, 40 points seems like a pretty good ceiling to me. I'm not sure I'd go too much higher, but I will say Washington media, you're going to have a fun time with him. Rasmus Sandin is one of the nicest guys I've ever talked to in hockey. And he's, he's got a lot of jokes too. So he likes to have fun. This one comes from Logan, so AKA Wolverine. Could Thatcher Demko be the number one fantasy goalie from here to the end of the season? Now that is spicy.
Yeah. So when I read this question, I was like, wait, was there a typo from Logan here? Did he mean the number one or a number one? I think a number one fantasy goalie makes a lot more sense than literally the best goalie in all of fantasy for the rest of the season. I think thinking of it as more, can you just be an above average, a top 10, let's say, fantasy goalie? I believe it. Since he came back, 4-1, 928 save percentage. And we know the Canucks have been more competitive since Rick Tocchet took over. So I think the team's playing with a little more fire around Demko. We know Demko is now healthy, so he's more likely to be himself. That's someone that I thought was going to be give or take a top 5 fantasy goalie going into the season. So I do think he can be top 5, top 10 for the balance of the season. Just keeping in mind, the team in front of him, it's not like the Canucks are an elite defensive club by any means, even with Rick Tocchet in town. So there's still going to be some track meets in there. So it's still possible Demko takes his lumps, but I like him as a number one fantasy goalie again for sure, now that it seems like he's back to full health. But just, we got to pump the brakes on number one. I don't think he's going to be more valuable than Linus Ullmark or Andrei Vasilevsky, one of those guys, Jake Ottinger, down the stretch.
Like that one. This one comes from Ranton and Raven. Any young goalies you're considering using a keeper slot for?
Yes, there are. And it's fun to answer this question here because I will be publishing a story on our site later this week looking at my favorite keeper stashes for next season, but it will be light on goalies because a lot of my favorite goalie keeper stashes, I believe, are blocked by their organization in terms of just veterans who are ahead of them on the depth chart. So, for example, I'm not going to answer Yaroslav Askarov. I'm not going to answer Jesper Wallstedt. In both those cases, those are probably the two best prospects in the game, goaltending-wise. They both have 2 veterans ahead of them that are both signed through next season. So I'm looking at guys that have more opportunities. One, I think, of course, is Pyotr Kochetkov. I still consider him a prospect, considering he's been sent down so many times this season. We know that Frederik Andersen and Antti Raanta both are not signed for next season. We know Kochetkov is. So his potential in fantasy is massive next year. I'm talking top 5 is his potential ceiling. I think he's got a tremendous opportunity, and the Canes view him as their long-term number one. So to me, that's your number one high priority stash as a keeper. The other one I'm looking at is Mads Søgaard in Ottawa. And this is a player who I don't know if anyone expected to see get an opportunity this soon. He's a really big guy. And I know you can correct me on this if I'm wrong, Stephen, but he was perceived as sort of a project from the moment the Senators drafted him. But he kind of got fast-tracked to the NHL this season because of all the injuries in Ottawa's net with Forsberg and Talbot. He was Rookie of the Month for February. He still has some competition now from Kevin Mandolisi. Is it Mandolisi? Mandolisi? Never said his name out loud, but the Kevin guy is also some competition. But if you look at the pedigree, I think Ottawa wants Søgaard to be their goalie of the future, ideally. And with Cam Talbot at UFA, I could see them trying out a tandem next year of Anton Forsberg with Søgaard. So that's another name. If I'm trying to be more realistic and look at goalies with opportunities, Kochetkov and Søgaard is who I have my eye on for next season.
To add to Søgaard, this is someone who there were a lot of flaws in his game when he got drafted. Obviously, the size was there, and athletically, I thought he was good, but he was putting himself, and I actually wrote on my own personal website a few years ago, I did a breakdown of how he overcommitted to plays way too often, and literally was using games like against like Canada at the World Juniors as an example, but it was like, this is the guy that's supposed to be saving their bacon in a game like that. And I felt like he was giving up, making way too many mistakes in his own crease and overcommitting. And that's not as big of a concern. So I am actually, I'm of the belief he is the goalie of the future for Ottawa. That to me was like, I've been saying for a while, maybe it's a hot take. I still think Ottawa is the next Canadian team to win the Stanley Cup. And I think he will be one of the reasons why. But we'll have to see kind of how that works out.
Oh, that's a sizzling take, Stephen. We need to get that on the website.
I've been kind of saying it for a few years after I gave up on Winnipeg, and I think Ottawa's just getting started. and we'll see. Like, you can't count at Edmonton. You can't count. Well, I want to count at the least, just based off of history. But yeah, it's like I still really like kind of like what Ottawa's doing, and they're gonna have an important draft, I think. This question comes from Alex Hurley. And do you think Ranta will be back this week? Should I hold on to Kachekov? And I was actually thinking about this because Peter Mrazek got hurt again yesterday. So it's like for the 15th time this season. And it's kind of crazy that Connor Ranta was kind of the guy that replaced him in Carolina.
That's right. And obviously, Ranta very injury prone. So is Freddie Anderson, which is why Kochetkov is so important. So again, make sure you check the time when you listen to this, Alex, if you're listening to our answer, because things change quickly. So we're recording this right now. It's 10:40 a.m. on Tuesday. So this is the information we have right now. I know that Antti Ranta, for Carolina's last game, he was listed as doubtful, which is different than being completely ruled out, which to me, that implies he was not that far off from returning, if it was at least a consideration that he could have played, right? So I wouldn't be surprised if we saw him by the end of this week. But that said, if you can find a way to hold on to Kochetkov as well, I think I would, just because you never know what's happening in that crease. And Kochetkov could get sent down, he could be recalled the next day because Anderson could tweak something. So if you can find a way to keep both on your roster, assuming you have both, try to hold on to them if you can.
All right, that's it for the questions. And now it's
all right,
the best part.
Yeah, good round of questions. And so, Stephen, I'm gonna give you a little curveball for the starting lineup this week, and I'm gonna ask you to set two fantasy lineups, because I was just looking outside at the snow, and it just makes me realize like March and April are the worst months in my opinion because they give you that hope that it's supposed to be spring, but it's not. They really should just shift the seasons a month, and I think everyone would be happier. But I inspired my topic for you. I want you to give me your best months top 6 and your worst months top 6 ranked right now.
So there's kind of a trend, and you'll start to maybe pick up on it, but I'll explain it afterwards. I want to start off with July. That's my birthday month, so I like that off the bat. But I also more care about just the weather's pretty good then. It's kind of just we just finished the bulk of free agency. We just finished the draft, the cup finals, like a chance to kind of just relax. So I'm a summer person, so I like July, which is why I also like August. And that's just because typically there's just not a lot going on. It's kind of nice. That's the month I try to go camping for a couple, 2 or 3 days every year. So I like doing that. May is another one I love. And May is because it's mostly sports related. I love the World Hockey Championship. That's always good. The Stanley Cup playoffs are in a good spot. The what else is going on? The Memorial Cup, so all this stuff, and of course the Indy 500. I'm a huge racing fan, so one of the biggest months. It's like literally like if you follow that race, you probably follow it the way most people do, which is you pay attention to every practice session for 2 weeks straight. So it becomes kind of an obsession, and it's a lot of fun. Then I'm going to go December, and this one was a tough one to put on, but it's because the start of the World Juniors. Christmas is a lot of fun. It just seems like everyone's happy. In Canada, global warming, weather has kind of made it so it's not as harsh as it maybe used to be, but I like December there. November is fun because that's when we get the first real international break of the hockey season, which is when we get all the mini tournaments going on. It's always fun to watch. I always find myself very busy and I can't watch 6 tournaments at one time, but I try to watch the U17s and I like to watch the U18 Five Nations in Michigan, so that's always good. And I believe my last one that'd be April, and that's I know you're not a huge fan of April, but a lot of family birthdays for me. It's also, just it's when the weather starts to turn. So that makes me happy. Months I don't like, I guess, are everything else. January, just there's not as much to look forward to. The weather sucks. It's just miserable. March, I'm always sick every March. So screw this month. I was sick last week and it's starting to be good now. February, it's just I love it for the Daytona 500, and then there's nothing else to look forward to for that entire month. September, it's just gives me memories of getting ready to go back to school. Even though it was a while ago, not a fan. June is just really busy and just it's fine, but I just like it when it's not as busy. And I guess if I've missed anything else, every other month. So this one was a interesting one, but it was kind of like there's something fun every month. I guess if you look at it that way, there's always something good about every month. But I like warm weather.
Okay, I dig it. I think I think June is great because you get the nice weather without all there aren't as many bugs and allergies and all those things that come.
Yeah,
Which
but
is why
watching
I
the
think
Stanley
September is
Cup,
bad.
but watching
September is
Stanley Cup
overrated.
final, watching the Cup final though in June feels so weird.
Yeah,
I know that's
true.
every year, but it's like I want to be outside.
That's fair. I'm gonna say March is the worst month because you're still in winter but everything's melty and gross. And then I'm gonna say best month for me, October, because you got the start of the hockey season, you got baseball playoffs, you got Halloween, you have weather where you can wear pretty much anything. You could wear a hoodie and shorts, a t-shirt and pants, a jacket, whatever you want. It's like the ultimate medium temperature month. So that's my number one. All right, that's a good list, Stephen. 2 good lists and a fun episode as well. Good luck, everyone, in your fantasy playoffs. We'll be back with more help next week. Thank you to Stephen. Thank you to Nick Alberga, and we'll see you soon.